Welcome to Preservation Perspectives, the podcast of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, known as the ACHP. I'm your host, Monica Rhodes, and if you're new here, the ACHP is the federal agency dedicated to safeguarding our nation's heritage through the historic preservation review process outlined in Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Today, we're talking about a groundbreaking step that merges federal policy with Indigenous knowledge, focusing specifically on Native Hawaiian knowledge systems and its role in cultural preservation. The ACHP recently approved an exemption for Indigenous knowledge-informed activities, allowing Native Hawaiian organizations to lead federally supported preservation projects without undergoing the review process. This shift empowers Native Hawaiian voices to protect their heritage on their own terms, with their own knowledge at the forefront. I'm excited to be joined today by two of the driving forces behind this milestone, ACHP Chair Sara Bronin and ACHP Tribal Member Amelia Marchand. Together, we'll discuss the significance of this change, how it came to be, and what it means for the future of preservation. So whether you're a preservation enthusiast, an advocate, or simply curious about the power of Indigenous knowledge in shaping policy, you won't want to miss this conversation. So Amelia and Sara, welcome. It's good to have you both. Just to get started, Amelia, with this action, can you tell me what this involves in considering Indigenous knowledge practices? Can you explain what that means in relation to this exemption?
Yes, thank you for having us and for highlighting this topic. So importantly, this exemption explicitly recognizes and acknowledges that Indigenous acts of cultural preservation are tied directly to Indigenous knowledges of Native Hawaiians and Native Hawaiian organizations and traditional cultural practices of Native Hawaiians. So these are activities that Native Hawaiians have been doing for hundreds of years, centuries, thousands of years. And those activities may be preservation, they may be restoration, rehabilitation, reconstruction, repair, maintenance, or stabilization of their own historic properties since time immemorial. And importantly, this exemption recognizes or defers to Native Hawaiian organizations and Indigenous knowledges of those entities and individuals as experts.
No, I think that's really fascinating. Uplifting traditional practices that, if we're honest, haven't always got the space to be able to communicate the values that they have known for generations and generations. So with that in mind, Amelia, why should a federal agency like the ACHP consider incorporating Indigenous knowledge into its work? What is the value in an agency like ACHP in helping to set a guidepost, a North Star to the importance of valuing traditional voices, Indigenous voices?
Excellent question. And that comes forward in so many different ways across the spectrum of the federal government and different sectors. But I think I would actually want to pass this one to Chair Bronin, because it was Chair Bronin who, along with my predecessor, ACHP member Reno Franklin, who initiated this entire process. So, Chair Bronin, will you please share a little bit about what you heard on the ground and how it, reflecting upon that, really impacted what you and Member Franklin thought for this?
Sure. Thanks for passing it over. I mean, we both saw this through to the finish line, so I think either of us could easily talk about it. But if you're asking about motivation, For me, um, as someone in this role since just last January 2023, one of the things that I think, learned most in this position is that there is a need for the federal government to recognize to a much greater extent Indigenous knowledge, which we don't define as an agency, but we do say is a series of practices, of traditions, of beliefs that have been cultivated and ingrained over the years in Indigenous peoples in a way that is rooted, at least in part, with their relationship to the environment. So everything that Amelia was just talking about are the manifestations of that. And when we think about activities as they're practiced by Native Hawaiian organizations, many of those activities do have a relationship with the federal government. When, for example, the federal government funds a restoration of a Native Hawaiian site or provides a permit for activities that might happen on Native Hawaiian land, or to help with Native Hawaiian, to help to support Native Hawaiian cultural practice. And so you do see a lot of federal nexus with these activities. But I think, for the ACHP, in March 2024, we adopted a policy statement on Indigenous knowledge and historic preservation, one that had been in the works even before my time, but that I was glad to help shepherd through with Chairman Reno Franklin, who, as our tribal member that preceded Amelia, represented not only his own tribe, but also his Native Hawaiian background, which made a really interesting and rich contribution to the agency. Together, he and I visited Maui to understand with FEMA and cultural leaders on the ground, the impacts of the wildfire, the rebuilding of which will undergo the process that our agency sets out. And in talking with leaders on Maui and on Oahu, and touring sites myself on Oahu, really found that there were a lot of new ways that the federal government's relationship with Native Hawaiians could be strengthened, not just in the rebuilding of Maui, but also in some of the sites on Oahu, and of course on other islands as well. Those just happened to be the places that I saw firsthand. So this exemption presented an opportunity to not only make good on our Indigenous knowledge and historic preservation policy statement, but also to advance what the Biden administration has been really focused on, which is improving relationships with Indigenous peoples across Indian tribes, Hawaii, and in other places as well. So that really was the impetus. The impetus was to, again, help us make good on our promise, confirm these administration-wide priorities, and affirm the importance of Indigenous knowledge in our own regulatory process, which is something entirely new.
Yeah. So Sara, I want to take a deep dive there into the regulatory process, internally. So you shared a little bit about, going to Maui with FEMA and those conversations, those important conversations with organizations, but internally within the ACHP, what was the process to get this exemption to this point?
So the first step in the exemption was, in this case, me as chair saying that this was a top priority and that we were going to consider how we would use an exemption to create this opportunity for greater integration of Indigenous knowledge. And the reason why, at first, I would say the reaction amongst our council members was a little bit, wait, what? Was because we've never used an exemption to actually promote historic and cultural preservation. We've only used exemptions 4 times in our agency's history to exempt federal agency activities. So, for example, we've done in the last 2 were to exempt electric vehicles from our review process and to exempt maintenance and repair activities of the General Services Administration. Those could be, at least the latter might be argued to be a way of preserving buildings, but neither are about cultural preservation, and neither were about really taking the exemption concept and turning it on its head and saying, well, actually, what we're doing is we are using this to respect Indigenous knowledge. So that was maybe the first hurdle. Through that process with Chairman Franklin, we sort of outlined what we would want for it to accomplish. And I definitely personally took the oar and started to draft the exemption in collaboration with staff and tried to flesh that outline out. We put it out for one round of public comment. We did a consultation with Native Hawaiian groups. We got a lot of feedback, and so we revised it and sent it out again for a second round. We work with our members to refine the final product, and then we circulated it for a vote. And for your listeners who are unfamiliar with the way that process works, we are 24 members, 10 of which are federal agencies, 11 of which are presidential appointees, and 3 of which represent organizations, including the National Trust and the conferences of state and tribal historic preservation officers. So together we work through the language that we thought would work best. And what we have here, I think, is a result of a lot of consultation and collaboration. And I'm really proud that it made it over the finish line.
Absolutely. This is incredible. So Sara, one other question while we're here is, so when you boil it down, what does this exemption essentially do? If at its core, how would you characterize that?
So what it does is it says that it is that Native Hawaiians, not the federal government, should be the ones determining how certain cultural conservation and preservation practices will be practiced by Native Hawaiian organizations who are involved in an activity with the federal government that would ordinarily trigger our review process. So the kinds of things that are exempted are landscaping practices and activities, agricultural or aquacultural activities, species and habitat conservation, the rehabilitation of water features and systems, agricultural terraces, pathways, sacred sites, some buildings and structures. Actually, this was something that Amelia added, and we did get a couple of comments on as well, but adaptations to respond to climate change, including sea level rise, erosion, wildfires, and increased precipitation, among others. So what we've tried to do is set out this range of actions where the federal government, once it's determined that those actions are informed by Indigenous knowledge and are led and managed by Native Hawaiian organizations, that's the end of the federal government's review process. So there are provisions there that talk about what happens if there might be a conflict and how to resolve those disputes. But in general, what we hope happens is that the priority is on protecting the activities and really making a statement as an agency that the federal government doesn't belong in every cultural conversation, especially when we're dealing with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just, it's reminding me of, how important it is when you're talking about the process to get it to this point with the public comment and the review and turning it back around and then presenting it back again and circulating it among Native Hawaiian organizations and cultural preservationists who are practicing that. All of that is that's that sausage making that we don't talk about that makes preservation really happen. It's very collaborative. It's not one organization. It's not one person. It's an effort by multiple organizations across the country in order to get it there. So I'm just, this is incredible and it's groundbreaking. And I just wanted to highlight this process of how preservation functions. Amelia, I'm going to turn back to you. Could you share with me, how was the input with Native Hawaiian organizations? How were they incorporated as a part of the process? How were their voices uplifted as we are moving through getting the exemption to this point?
So one of the things I think is really important to continue to recall is that this proposal came directly as a response from that visit to Maui, from those conversations with Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners from the beginning. And I think, planting that seed and then moving the dial forward in partnership and making sure that addressing concerns to the best of the ACHP's ability with all the other members. That, not only is it vital to be that inclusive, but it's also vital to be that accountable to the Native Hawaiian communities and practitioners. And so there was actually 3 different rounds of just consultation with Native Hawaiian organizations. 2 of those opportunities occurred, I believe, in June, and then a third was held in August. And each time there was able to be a little bit more refinement, a little bit more, clarification brought forward. And one thing that I wanted to share, which we kind of started to, Chair Bronin had started to address, was the cultural practices of natural habitat conservation and to support species. So, like in so many, traditions and regions of the world, not just our country, fishing and aquaculture are so important. And so one of the changes that was made as a part of this back and forth feedback and communication and input was the ACHP really was able to reflect that the commitment of the agency to advance this fact that is well known to many, many Native peoples, that natural resources are cultural resources. And that's something that is really embedded and vital to Indigenous knowledges, but is also just very important to have federal agencies recognize that. So on one hand, I think that's a really very important piece of this that can be easily kind of overlooked. But also, some of the feedback included the need for ACHP to clarify that federal agencies and their decisions regarding access to land, undertakings that may be contrary or limiting to NHO or Native Hawaiian cultural practices, that some of those things were actually not going to be covered by the exemption. So clarifying and that additional refinement was also a really big piece of the discussions that we had. I think one of the other clarifications that came through was regarding dispute resolution as well. In the event that a federal agency learns that there may be an unexpected or unanticipated conflict after they decide to use the exemption. So there was all of this kind of back and forth and providing ample space and time for these meetings, but not just the consultation meetings themselves, but also providing written comments and going through the process of reviewing those comments is very important and detailed and time consuming, but so vital to making sure that the good faith effort and the intent of this will be met to the best of all of our ability. So I'm also really happy that one of the I guess you could say additions or revisions included using Native Hawaiian language in the proposal itself, because these concepts of cultural preservation, they're embedded in Indigenous knowledge, which is embedded in languages. And so including the actual terminology from Native Hawaiian language to identify what type of traditional practice they're referring to, or what type of location or place or property, historic property, traditional cultural property is being referred to, that means a lot. That means a lot. Not everything has to be translated into the English language when we have perfectly functional ways to describe it in the native language of the people that it pertains to.
As you were sharing a bit, I was thinking about, like, this is a new chapter in cultural preservation that's been written here, right? Being, as Sarah shared, that this is the fourth time that this exemption, or the ability to exempt, has been used within ACHP's history, and the first time that's focused in on cultural preservation. I mean, this is precedent setting, in my opinion. And Sarah and Amelia, I want to hear from you both on what are the next steps here. So now that we shifted into this new space, now that the bar has been raised for the intentionality that it takes to really be thoughtful about preservation for all groups, and ensuring that is the strategies are specific to the culture. What do we do with that? What are our next steps here?
I'm going to jump just 10 steps ahead and say that one of the original provisions in the first draft was a provision that would have explicitly allowed for this exemption to be extended to tribal nations on the mainland outside of Hawaii. Okay. So at some point in the future, presuming that this exemption works well, which I predict it will, and is something that is demanded by Native Hawaiian organizations to be applied to their Indigenous knowledge informed activities that are supported by or involve the federal government, then I view this as an excellent template for the consideration of expansion to Indian tribes and exempting those activities that have Indigenous knowledge informed nature, but instead of maybe the fish ponds and the taro root terraces, and I don't want to use Hawaiian terms because I won't do them justice, but there will be other activities that are relevant to Indian tribes in the outside of Hawaii. So thinking about how it could be used as a template for the future is something that I've not only included in the first draft, although it was removed in response to comment, but it's something that should be top of mind as we start to administer that. And I think Amelia, as chair of our committee on tribal and Indigenous peoples, is going to be leading the implementation and the next steps for the exemption itself. So I'm going to turn back to her, and she can talk about how we're going to do that part of it.
Thank you. So fundamentally, there's the nuts and bolts and the process, right? The steps along the way. And so first of all, we're actually in just a couple short weeks going to be meeting with our Tribal and Indigenous Peoples Committee to talk about the next steps. We'll be doing kind of press release and or a Federal Register notice to all the federal preservation officers, to the Native Hawaiian organizations listserv that we have for 106 activities. And we're also going to be like planning out this implementation process to collaborate with our federal partners to kind of get down into those nuts and bolts of the federal grant programs that fund NHO activities in Hawaii, and like identifying what will qualify and sharing that information with the agency staff. So a lot of it is also going to be tracking these activities and who's using the exemption, identifying success stories, identifying, at what points is there going to be a little bit of challenge when we experience these activities on the ground, and then share this information out with other federal partners too. By and large, I also think it is time to also celebrate our successes when we can. And this is a success. As Chair Bronin shared, this could potentially be a wonderful thing to bring to the mainland. This is something that will continue to support and advance cultural preservation, which is what we want. And any way that we can do that through culturally appropriate and respectful measures and mechanisms in tandem with partnership from federal agencies, SHPOs, we're going to do that. So really excited about what's going to come.
I'll say the future is bright. And Sara and Amelia, thank you for your time today in explaining this process. Thank you both, along with former member Reno Franklin, for your leadership to do this work. And for all that are tuned in, please be sure to follow the ACHP on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube to keep up with the latest in historic preservation. I'm Monica Rhodes. Thank you for joining us on Preservation Perspectives.
Thanks for having us.